Coming up on Network Africa, Sudan's military authorities move former President Omar al-Bashir to a maximum security prison. Egypt's parliament backs measures that could extend President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's term in office. Plus, 150 people missing in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo after a boat capsized in Lake Kivu. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Amarachi Ubani. We begin today in Sudan, where former President Omar al-Bashir has been moved to Koba maximum security prison just days after he was deposed in a military coup. Reports say the former leader has until now been detained at the presidential residence under heavy guard. He is reportedly being held in solitary confinement and is surrounded by tight security. Months of protests in Sudan led to the ousting and the arrest of the long-term ruler on Thursday last week. However, demonstrators have vowed to stay on the streets until there is an immediate move to civilian rule. Meanwhile, Sudanese military delegation has held its first meeting with the African Union at its headquarters in Addis Ababa. Talks with the AU Commission Chief Museveni Mahamat comes after the Pan-African body's Peace and Security Council gave the junta a 15-day deadline to hand power to a civilian-led administration or face expulsion. That delegation, led by Lieutenant General Jalal al-Sheikh al-Tayeb, gave Mr. Mahamat a written message from a military ruler, Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah Burhan. The AU has, however, not divulged its content. The African Union is currently chaired by Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who also took power in a coup in 2014. Staying with Sudan, Uganda says it will consider offering asylum to ousted Sudanese leader Omar al-Bashir despite his indictment by the International Criminal Court. Mr. Bashir faces an ICC arrest warrant over the death of an estimated 300,000 people during an insurgency in Sudan's western Darfur region over a decade ago. Foreign Minister Okello Oryem says Mr. Bashir is yet to contact Kampala for possible refuge, but he says there is no harm in considering the fallen Sudanese leader for political asylum. It all seems a little confusing at this point. Let's get some clarity now from Professor of International Law and Jurisprudence, Professor Oyebode. Professor, thank you for joining us on Network Africa. Let's begin with the obvious, though. What do you make of Uganda's willingness to consider granting Omar al-Bashir asylum, despite the fact that Kampala is a member of the ICC and is compelled under the ICC as the Rome Statute to hand him over to the criminal court?
Well, the granting of asylum is a prerogative of every state. It's actually political. And the offer of Uganda is quite understood. Museveni is one of the staple leaders in Africa. So he might have special consideration for a fellow sit-tight leader who has lost control of his throne. So it's a political act, and every state has the prerogative of deciding whether or not to grant any fugitive asylum.
Mr. Bashir is under ICC indictment for suspected genocide in Darfur, but the traditional military government in Khartoum says it will not hand him over and instead may try him in Sudan. Is it possible, Professor, for justice to really be served if he's tried internally?
Well, al-Bashir has flouted the warrant of arrest issued by the ICC. He once visited South Africa for an African Union conference, and he just left unceremoniously when people were raising hymns and cries about his presence. don't forget also that he visited Nigeria for an African Union confab, but also he vanished when things were becoming hot. So he's a notorious flouter of international law, and is disrespectful of rights. Remember also what happened in Darfur when a number of Nigerian soldiers were killed, not to talk of the atrocities of the Janjaweed in Sudan. So I'm not surprised that the military people in Sudan will want to keep him within Sudan and not surrender him to The Hague. But I think if there is sustained outcry demanding his surrender, Sudan might have no alternative but yield him to justice.
It remains to be seen, Professor, whether that will happen. But the African Union, which you spoke about earlier, has given Sudan's military government a 15-day deadline during which they're supposed to hand over to a civilian administration, or the country itself will face expulsion from the African Union. How genuine do you think this call is, considering the fact that the AU is currently chaired by Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who himself took over power in a coup in 2014?
Well, the African Union, since the decision in Yamoussoukro, had agreed that coups should not be a form of changing government. But the case of Sudan is a little bit peculiar because he had tacit support. I'm talking of Omar Bashir. He enjoyed the comfort of the African Union. So I think they are treating the case with kid gloves. I think it's just an empty threat, which might not come into light. I assume that the process of transition will be continued to its ultimate conclusion, so that we are soon going to have a transition government comprising civilians. My impression is that the Sudanese military are looking for a civilian person to be prime minister or interim president, who will now arrange the transition. So that will cause the bluff of the African Union. I think it's just to be consistent with its anti-coup policy. I'm talking of the African Union, but it might not come to much, because if you can survive without the African Union, you could defy the African Union if such a situation arises. I think many people will be glad to see the back of Omar el-Bashir, because he's been like a saw to the African conscience. And you know how the independence of South Sudan emerged, and how he threatened and wanted to overwhelm the African leaders in South Sudan. So this is a man that most people have a distaste for. I don't think he will enjoy the sympathy of anybody anymore.
Seen, Professor, he does have some cronies on the continent, but he's one of three long-term serving leaders who have been ousted from power in the last 2 years. What message does this send to others, such as Cameroon's Paul Biya, Uganda's Yoweri Museveni, and of course Equatorial Guinea's Teodoro Obiang Mbasogo?
I think Africa is giving such type leaders a yellow card, and the people themselves will deliver the red card. But things have become uncomfortable, very hot for Africans that defy democracy. And I think it's a good move by the African Union to sound it loud and clear that the African continent is no longer comfortable, with leaders that shun democracy and the right of the people to go to heaven the way they want. I think it's a useful development, a development that should be congratulated and celebrated, because actually most people are sick and tired of sit-tight leaders who defy the will of their people. So I think it's a measure that should be celebrated.
Indeed. Professor Akin Oyebode, always a pleasure having you on Network Africa. Thanks again for joining us on the program.